Shall I start? Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I hope you're all well. Welcome to the second webinar of 2021 webinar series on the interpretation of World Heritage, titled World Heritage Multiple Memories, hosted by Cultural Heritage Administration of Republic of Korea. I am Harry Shim from the Preparatory Office for the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of World Heritage Sites under the auspices of UNESCO. The Preparatory Office is an organizer of this event, a UNESCO Category 2 Center to be carrying out researching, capacity building, networking in the field of heritage interpretation. The center will be officially established by end of this year. The webinar series is also in collaboration with the African World Heritage Fund, another UNESCO Category 2 center in the field of World Heritage in Africa. We expect this webinar series to serve as a forum for discussing the peaceful management of World Heritage in conflict and the effective implementation of the World Heritage Convention. We organized this webinar series to identify and to discuss various new issues related to multi-layered narratives and sometimes conflicting interpretations of history that are attached to World Heritage. Since adopting the convention, heritage conservation has focused more on protecting physical aspect of heritage. However, as we can see from the recent dissonant cases in heritage, there is a rising interest on multiple narratives due to diverse stakeholder groups and community engagement in heritage management. So we plan to offer a series of discussions to talk about how to protect our heritage and to manage the conflict in this multi-dimensional society. Facing 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention next year, I think this series will raise timely questions and provide good discussions for a better protection of our heritage. In the first webinar, which was held last month, we talked about the values that were overlooked by the World Heritage Convention and the need for the new approaches to protecting World Heritage. As an extension of the discussion in the first webinar, we now will talk about the dissonance on World Heritage. We will discuss the nature of the dissonance in heritage context. What do we mean by dissonance? Who decides which issues to be addressed? What approaches to use? Can conflict in heritage be prevented? And is the dissonance only negative in heritage? And now I would like to give a brief introduction about our moderator, Dr. Kamini Wijayasuriya. Born in Sri Lanka, Dr. Kamini Wijayasuriya is an architect, archaeologist, and renowned heritage conservation and management professional with over 40 years of experience. He's known internationally for his work on World Heritage and pioneering work on people-centered approaches to the conservation of nature and culture. Among his major contributions are the Resource Manual on Managing Cultural World Heritage published by UNESCO and edited volumes on authenticity and traditional knowledge systems. He has held the positions as the head of the conservation in Sri Lanka and as the first Asian staff member of the ICROM. Currently, he is a special advisor to the Director General of ICROM based in Rome and a special advisory to the Director of the WITRAP, World Heritage Institute of Training and Research for the Asia and the Pacific region under the auspices of UNESCO, based in Shanghai, China. Before beginning the webinar, I would like to let you know that you can leave your questions or comments during our webinar. As it is streamed on Zoom and also on YouTube, please give your question through Zoom Q&A box if you're on Zoom, and please leave your comments under the video if you're on our YouTube. There will be a Q&A session after this discussion, so please share your thoughts. Now I would like to turn the time over to our moderator. Welcome, Gamini. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you. And it is a great privilege to come back to the interpretation webinar series. Once again, congratulations to you and the team at the Category 2 Center for the wonderful start. Welcome to all of you from all over the world to the second webinar series on the interpretation of World Heritage, focusing on multiple voices and different memories. In this particular session of the series, we will focus on dissonance on World Heritage, multiple voices with different memories. During the first webinar, Christina Cameron and her team highlighted two issues which exist in the World Heritage system that can be considered as impediments to the acknowledgement of multiple voices and different memories in their interpretation. The two issues were the heavy focus on universality or the universal values over local values and heavy emphasis on physical conservation over interpretation. They acknowledged the dissonance and had a brief discussion as well. In my view, if I may, I would add a third issue, which is the national sovereignty guaranteed by the convention that needs to be in the same context. However, today at the outset, I wish to bring back 3 points raised in my presentation during the first webinar series. The first point is that the sector has advanced towards people-centered approaches, which exhibits a paradigm shift of moving from care of heritage to that of pursuing the well-being of both heritage and society as well. This places the people at the heart of the heritage discourse. The second point is how values are central to conservation and management decision-making, which is also gaining popularity. Both these points oblige heritage practitioners, of course, academics also theorize, to move beyond their conventional concerns, such as physical conservation, decay of materials, authenticity, etc., to focus on multiple voices, different memories, writing of widely consulted inclusive narratives, rights and rights holders, and range of other people-centric issues. These are challenging tasks. Trying to accommodate multiple voices and different memories, attempts to dominate one over the others, dominance of official narratives, links beyond nation states are not easy and inevitably would create dissonance and conflicts. Some would argue that all heritage places are contested. It is in this context that I emphasize the third point, that interpretation to be an integral part of management so that issues of multiple voices and different memories can be discussed from the beginning with all relevant stakeholders in the management planning process. Dissonance is relatively a new term for us. The Oxford Dictionary defines dissonance as, I quote, combination of musical notes that sounds harsh together, which is interesting, but to make our lives easier, it also defines as lack of agreement. Hope we will discuss this further. Cambridge and Ashworth, in their book, well-known book, Dissonance and Heritage, the management of the past as a resource in conflict. I know this is a relatively old book, utilizes the concept of dissonance in discussing the principles and practices of heritage management. According to them, the idea of dissonance conveys two key elements: ideas of discrepancy and incongruity, and an implicit analogy with musical harmony, which implies the possibility of a move towards consonance or some form of optimum balance. Dissonance, therefore, according to them, provides both a tool of description and a guide to planning interventions. Hope this will be useful in our discussion. We will continue from where Christina and her team left on dissonance today with three distinguished speakers. They will first make a brief position statement like last time, and they will then join the discussion. Let me briefly introduce them. The first speaker, the Dacia Rose, Senior Lecturer in Heritage and Politics of the Past, Department of Archaeology, and Deputy Director of the Cambridge Heritage Research Center. She first became interested in the role of heritage in conflict and peace building while working briefly at UNESCO and observing the organization's projects in Bosnia-Herzegovina area. Her books include Reconstructing Spain, Cultural Heritage and Memory After the Civil War, and the co-edited volumes, War and Cultural Heritage, and Memorials and Aftermath of War. And then we also have Dr. Pascal Tarvinga. He holds a PhD in archaeology with specialization in World Heritage, stakeholders, and sustainable development aspects. Over 20 years of experience in heritage management, he has held various senior and executive positions in Africa with proven success in the public sector, locally, regionally, and internationally. Currently, Chief Heritage Officer for Robben Island World Heritage Sites in South Africa. He has strong bias in museums, heritage sites, archives, and protected areas with cultural heritage, bilateral and partnership programs, World Heritage, human resource management, financial management, administration, and leadership. Works closely with all advisory bodies to UNESCO in Africa and has over 25 refereed articles in international journals and forthcoming book on World Heritage and Sustainable Development. He has a desire in contributing to the evolving and decolonizing heritage landscape in Africa in a creative and innovative manner, addressing issues of sustainable development, heritage governance, conflict solutions, climate change, sustainability, building resilient bridges for conservation in Africa. We also have Dr. Peter B. Larsen, who is an anthropologist who works on heritage conservation and social justice issues at both local and global level. After initial experiences in Oxford, Geneva, and Lausanne, he lectured on sustainable development, environmental anthropology, and human rights at the Department of Archaeology of the University of Lausanne. He is currently senior lecturer in the universities of Zurich and Geneva, where he teaches heritage studies, sustainable development, and anthropology. He works actively with several international organizations, NGOs, and academic partners to strengthen analysis and policy discussions on a wide range of sustainability and social justice topics. Recent books include Post-Frontier Resource Governance, The Anthropology of Conservation NGOs, World Heritage and Human Rights, and World Heritage and Sustainable Development. The last, I had the privilege of working with Peter as well. So, let me now invite Dacia to make her first statement.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Harry, and the organizers for the invitation to participate in this conversation. And thank you, Kamini, for the kind introduction to us all. So as I'm first, I thought I would start with stating what I think we all know, that this idea of cultural heritage is a series of monuments or objects of purely historical and aesthetic value has been superseded by an understanding that heritage is at least as much, if not more, intangible than it is tangible, that it's a process of doing, of meaning making, a communicative action that draws on and provokes emotional responses. The implication of understanding heritage as a process of meaning making is that it's a highly political and continuously evolving one. And this volatility disturbs the kind of semantic stability previously associated with heritage sites. The Arab Spring in Egypt, for instance, and you see some images at the bottom of the slide, added new symbolic aspects to the seemingly immovable and unquestionably patrimonial pyramids of Giza. The difficulties lie in that what can be contradictory tensions as to the meanings and uses of heritage sites for their diachronic, by which I mean that their meaning and associative values are constantly changing and added to with time. So there are 3 points I wanted to make, which are up there on the slide. The first is that dissonance in heritage is unavoidable because of this process that involves actors, values, context, different perspectives, approaches. So trying to avoid dissonance is futile. It's not possible. And ignoring it and leaving it unattended can actually be quite dangerous, as it can ignite tensions resulting in anything from frustrated expectations to violent confrontations. So why is it urgent to discuss dissonance? Partly because leaving it unattended is a bit dangerous, but also because we're seeing this increasing number of nominations for World Heritage Sites to do with recent conflicts. And these conflicts constitute events that have historical legacies that continue to inform identity narratives and structure relationships within and between countries today. So the interpretation policies for heritage sites related to conflict are particularly important for their potential to go either way, either perpetuating cycles of violence or enabling peace-building work. And such policies are effective when they acknowledge the past harms and open up discussions to how the legacies of those can continue to affect people in the present. This isn't something that's past and kind of gone, but that continues to affect our relations, right? Which brings me to the second point. Dissonance results not from embracing diversity, but actually from singular narratives that clash. So X says that the site means one thing and selectively draws on history to back that vision. Y says that the site means something different and draws on different parts of that history skipped over by X to back that vision. That's where the conflict is, in these singularities that clash, not in embracing diversity. So heritage should not be about a competition as though it was a zero-sum struggle over scarce resources, but multi-directional. This means subject to ongoing, continuous negotiation and cross-referencing. If the use of World Heritage to build bridges to peace is to be more than an aspiration, we need lucid assessments of its potential to create rifts, to fuel conflict, as well as a mode of kind of dialogical interpretation, continuous, ongoing, and flexible, that allows for negotiating often conflicting views. So often ambitions to offer up a kind of universal story at heritage sites can have the opposite effect, not of opening up dialogue, but actually closing them down by privileging one interpretation over all others. So rather than resist or avoid dissonance, what I suggest is trying to find strategies for embracing it and developing it more creatively and developing creative and flexible interpretive frameworks for it. Which brings me to my final point, which is that interpretation can make dissonance part of the appeal of World Heritage, part of its attraction, by harnessing dissonance and working on the relations between people, between communities, between these perspectives. The 2018 Savoir report in France on the restitution of African cultural heritage calls for what is called a new relational ethics. And I think this too can be applied to the interpretation of World Heritage sites. Work on agonism, for instance, as proposed by Chantal Mouffe, suggests that the importance of bringing together conflicting interpretations rather than trying to find some sort of neutral or objective meeting point. Heritage institutions that have deliberately developed interpretation plans that address the points of friction have seen audience numbers grow and have received positive feedback from them. And there were examples that were talked about in the last webinar, particularly from Northern Ireland. A joined-up approach would link World Heritage sites with their intangible dimensions, the associated stories, myths, folklore, performances, know-how, as well as the creative industries, crafts, and arts as vehicles for the expression of diverse perspectives. So incorporating creativity into heritage management can help harness the unknowns, the uncertainties. We don't know and we don't understand everything about the past. This isn't necessarily a problem, though it can be an inspiration for curiosity and a way of fostering a drive for discovery. And so just to conclude, I think interpretation centers at World Heritage sites could thus act as hubs of creativity, training, expression, rather than just communicators of expert knowledge. The legacies of heritage aren't just about passing on certainties, but also about passing on questions that are still to be answered, making the pursuit of knowledge rather than a passive consumption of facts central to the interpretation plans that can open up the process to become much more flexible and responsive. And that's my position to get us off started.
Thank you, Dacia. It's a great start. Looking at heritage more as intangible, and then your 3 points. The dissonance is unavoidable, which I also believe strongly, and of course, problem is not embracing all or collectivity or diversity, and then also can have positive impacts. So interpretation centers can act as hub. It's a good proposition, and hope we can continue with the discussion. And may I now invite my colleague Pascal for your intervention or your position to be explained. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gamin, and thank you to the organizers of this webinar, which is very important and looking at an issue that is central to heritage management on the African continent. And I've titled my presentation as Dissonance and Contested Spaces in African Perspective. My first point is that when you look at heritage and dissonance in Africa, they are inseparable and intertwined within multicultural and multiracial spaces. And what it means is that different groups have different interpretations and views of heritage and the related spaces. While one group could see a particular space of heritage as representing their victory and celebrating it, another group could see the same space as representing their oppression. This makes heritage issues and spaces become a contested terrain as an ongoing process. So it has no starting, it has got no ending. It's a societal issue and it's an interpretation issue. And my second point is that if you look at Africa also, the story of the perpetrator and the victim in the colonial and post-colonial period has dominated heritage management and interpretation in Africa. It has always defined how heritage should be seen, managed, and presented. It is the story of conflicting values, interpretation, and management choices, including commitments of those that are in charge of heritage. For instance, in Africa, monuments lists were dominated by sites associated with colonialism and at the expense of sites associated with the indigenous communities. There is a site in Zimbabwe called the British Pioneer Column, which was celebrating a defeated battalion of the Pioneer Column, not celebrating the victorious Ndebele regiment. And this caused a lot of dynamics, and now the site is trying to balance the two. And when you look at Robben Island, the site that I'm managing, it's heavily associated with dissonance. It's a multi-layered cultural landscape with political period being prioritized over everything else. But within that political landscape, there are politics within politics. There are different political groups. And we have adopted inclusive and holistic interpretation approach to try and address those imbalances, and we are giving voices even to warders and women that used to visit the island to see their husbands there. We need everybody to tell the story. We need to have an inclusive story. It's a contested terrain from different angles. And my third point is that when you look at world heritage, I think it has to respond to the local context and dynamics of heritage in Africa. And to that end, I will give an example of the sites of social memory and sites of conflicts. For example, in Rwanda, where the state party is desiring to enlist that as world heritage, but some people are seeing it as divisive heritage. So the question is, we must allow the local to define what heritage should be protected, what heritage should be put forward for World Heritage listing, and how it should be separated, because I think society has a role. And my fourth point is that when you look at dissonance, I think it's a seed for multiple voices to be embraced in the management and interpretation of World Heritage sites. However, also, dissonance is also a double-edged sword, and it depends on the motives of the involved players, the context, and the mediator in the process. And I still think that the state party has a bigger responsibility to address these issues before they become universal issues, because to me, heritage first and foremost is local, and solutions must come from the local context of the heritage sites. And of course, my last point is that when we look at mitigation at mitigating dissonance at World Heritage sites in Africa or anywhere else, I think it's going to be a function of inclusivity, holistic narratives, and how our strategic pillars like research and interpretation and management are actually geared to address these issues in an inclusive way. But of course, you will need to adopt a stakeholder-driven process with inbuilt conflict resolution or mediation mechanisms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pascal. Thank you very much. Yes, your idea of this dissonance is central to heritage management, and the idea that these are inseparable and within a contested territories, and of course, contesting values and local context is so important, and dissonance as a seed for multiple voices, but it's also a double-edged sword, and of course, the process driven by multiple stakeholders and giving voice to locals is something that are very important, and hope we can discuss them further. Now, thank you again, and may I now invite Peter, my colleague, to make your statement. Peter.
Thank you so much, Gamini. Indeed, thank you also to the two other panelists for absolutely interesting perspectives here. Much has been said. I would like to entitle my intervention towards dissonant resonance, playing a bit with the dichotomy here in the World Heritage System. Here's an image from recent work where I had the privilege and pleasure to work with archaeologists and from the University of Warsaw, together with heritage colleagues from Sudan in the Nubian part of Sudan in the northern state. So I'll get back to that in a second. I have 4 key points I'd like to make, and then a conclusion why I think we need to move towards what I call dissonant resonance. My first point is, as has been said already, we know from the literature now and experiences that World Heritage entails multiple types and forms of dissonance at multiple levels, even with it starting from within the community, within different stakeholders, to the highest level of geopolitical tensions between countries. These are forms of dissonance that can paralyze heritage processes, that can even create conflict, militarized conflict, but also simply that can slow down work to conserve heritage and actually engage with heritage in wider sustainable development. So these are real issues that need attention for multiple reasons. My second point is that, and this goes in line a bit with what Dacia was also saying, is that dissonance is not necessarily, I would say, a bad thing. On the contrary, it's very much, these are signs and signals of issues to take seriously. Think of Black Lives Matter, think of other processes that highlight divides in society, tensions between countries, inequalities, legacies of human rights violations, all the kinds of ghosts in the closet, of course, that characterize society, that characterize our world. Our world is not without problems and issues. So the question is, how do we deal with this in heritage, and how do we actually empower heritage processes to play a constructive role in dealing with these? And this leads me to my third point, is that indeed there have been efforts, as Gamini was also indeed pointing to, the growth of people-centered approaches in the World Heritage System opens up for new reflections in this regard. Also, we have sustainable development policies addressing issues like conflict resolution, peace building, like human rights-based approaches, as well as central to World Heritage management. Now, this has enabled some small changes taking place, ranging from advisory body efforts to incorporate some of these questions, dialogues with states parties, some states parties moving forward also in addressing these issues, but also, as we see, of course, also a huge number of processes and dynamics going the other way, trying to sort of not address these issues where dissonance is appearing, and rather trying to hide them. So this leads me to the fourth point, which is dissonance remains in the World Heritage System. What we might say is the elephant in the room. What the progress that there has been in terms of a more proactive approach to deal with these issues is clearly not enough. When issues of dissonance appear at different moments for particular states or nominations, there's a lot of uneasiness. There's also still a pattern and a trend of the World Heritage Committee tending to overrule dissonance or not allow for sufficient dialogue, whether it comes from requests from experts, communities, civil societies, or other members from the World Heritage Committee, and so on. So those are 4 starting points. Now, where do we go from here? I think we need to move towards a new situation where dissonance is prioritized, as we have discussed and indeed the World Heritage Committee has started to move on in terms of human rights. We need to move from a situation where the system tends to favor glossy, good-feeling presentations with little room for divergent perspectives, and even in a situation currently where it gets, we even tend to have a system that penalizes or punishes countries that actually try to be more explicit and open about issues of dissonance, rights infringements, and so on. And we need to change this. I think there's a growing space and foundation now for practices where backstage dealings, problems, past legacies can be put at the front stage of World Heritage work, where there are carrots for countries and state parties to actually make this a clear, explicit emphasis and generate and mobilize that state party energy to show how solutions can be found. How, rather than to hide and put it under the carpet, so to speak, how state commitments can be mobilized to resolve, to reconcile, and to rebuild, rather than hide away, impose, and cement dissonant positions. So returning to this work that we've been doing for the last couple of years with wonderful colleagues in Nubia and Sudan in the site of Dongola, we just a few weeks ago had very good stakeholder dialogues about actually how to bridge these different perspectives. Polish archaeologists have been working for 6 decades, particularly looking at medieval layers, but increasingly also opening up to other dimensions of this archaeological heritage. The picture you see here is indeed also a presentation from the local imam, also presenting about an Islamic perspective. It's trying to actually show the different layers, the different perspectives was central to the work we're doing. Now, why do I mention this? because as has been said throughout the presentations today, there are different perspectives, there are different ideas about what heritage is significant. We know this, it's omnipresent, but I think the key moment now is to nurture heritage processes that allow for these to come together and create a new form of resonance that allows for different perspectives to be. So I completely join previous panelists about this embracing dissonance and also seeing this as a seed for multiple voices, as Pascal said. So thank you. Those were my starting points towards a dissonant resonance with more amplitude, vibrant voices, and exchanges around heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. You summarized what you were saying also nicely. Thank you. And of course, the multiple nature of this dissonance, resonance, and the use or not use of existing tools within the World Heritage system, and also need to do more. And of course, where we go from here. We want to hear it again. I have some questions, particularly in this direction, so we'll come back to that. And so thank you very much for that nice, wonderful, thought-provoking presentation. Now, you have heard all these things. Of course, I have some questions for further reflections, but some of them you have already answered. But you know, as we all heard, dissonance is something unavoidable, particularly in the process where we are now looking at values and participatory approaches and people-centered approaches and so on. And it's always the conflicts or the dissonance will come again and again. And my first question is, again, going back to some of the things you explained, sorry for that, but what is your understanding of the term dissonance in relation to heritage and in World Heritage context? Particularly in World Heritage context, I know some of you explained it, but let's elaborate a little bit more on that, if I may. Anyone would like to volunteer, or can I ask Dacia to start with?
Yeah, I can get us started. Also, I think Peter and Pascal and you, Gamini, have already kind of introduced us to this. Yeah. And I like Pascal's metaphor of the double-edged sword in dissonance very much. I mean, for me, I went back to dissonance, not looking at it so much in terms of resonance the way Peter did, but trying to look, what's the opposite of dissonance? Well, it's harmony, and yet dissonant, because, it's, as you said, Gamini, it's a kind of musical metaphor that we're using here. And it feels like dissonance in music is really important. It's used musically to evoke emotion. It's used as a building block for harmony, for example, in jazz. So I think that there can be something there that we can also continue borrowing a little bit further from the musical analogies to think about how dissonance can be part of something of a whole, and something that helps us get closer to at least emotional or associative truth, if not necessarily factual. I think my understanding of dissonance is, in terms of site interpretation, is really about broadening the scope of its associative value. And understanding dissonance in relation to heritage is about a lack of harmony in relation to how heritage is related to, valued, used, understood. But it feels like if dissonance is a kind of cacophony of different sounds and voices, then it's just a question of finding not necessarily a common thread, and certainly not letting one of them overimpose or superimpose itself on the others, but finding a way in which that becomes a richness. And we've talked a lot recently in heritage about communities and community involvement and allowing the community voice to be heard. But of course, as we all know, community doesn't speak with one voice. When you allow community to speak, there is dissonance, because communities speak in many different voices, right? But that has to be a good thing, because I think in the past, engaging with communities was resisted because of the dissonance that comes with it. And often when the engagement was done, it was like, okay, well, we'll choose that spokesperson from the community and talk to that one person as the voice of the community. And that also led to problems. So I think, what the challenge for us is opening up the space for as many voices as possible without kind of losing complete track of what it is we're talking about. And I think that can be done through collection of oral histories, through letting people talk about their own heritage in their own terms. So I think it can be done. We just have to find the vehicles for doing it. And for me, it goes through that thinking of heritage as a creative process, a creative space, not just a load that you inherit from the past.
Thank you, Dacia. You want to add anything? You have already explained, Peter and Pascal, but you want to bring any example or anything like that and add 1 or 2 lines to this because we have more discussion points.
Maybe I can add an example.
Yeah, that would be great.
How dissonance is actually demonstrating our inability to agree or produce inclusive narratives. And this affects conservation, management, presentation, and interpretation of world heritage sites. For example, at Robben Island, the main point of Robben Island as a world heritage site is the political imprisonment, which underlines the OUV. And within that OUV, the brand inception or the interpretation point of departure is the late Nelson Mandela, how many years he spent there and how he contributed to a peaceful transition into the democracy that we're enjoying at the moment. But when you ask yourself, you say, is he the only political prisoner that went to Robben Island? There are other 3,500 ex-political prisoners. We have got their individual experience apart from them contributing to the overall narrative of the experience as political prisoners. And then you also deepen that and you ask yourself, are the political prisoners the only people that were on the island? No. We have the banishment landscape, which is associated with traditional chiefs that were banished to the island for resisting colonialism, which then turned into apartheid. It started with the British and then ended with the Dutch, who then introduced apartheid. How are we commemorating that? How are we involving them in the management process? And there's also the lepers that were banished to the island because of their medical condition, which has got nothing to do with politics, but still they had to actually survive on the island, just like the political prisoners. So what I'm trying to say is that heritage management has failed to learn from other disciplines, like, for example, music, where, if I can give an example of an orchestra, where you have a conductor. And I think state parties are conductors of this orchestra, but they must be able to allow the violinist, the drummer, the vocalist, and the guitarist to play their part in producing this one piece, which becomes a song that can win an award. So we don't learn from other disciplines, and I think it's time we get outside our box and learn from other disciplines on embracing differences and different interpretations. Because to me, heritage always takes different meanings at different places and in different times. So dissonance is an evolving process at World Heritage Sites. Thanks.
Thank you. I was expecting that case study example. Peter, you want to add something, or we can go into? Yeah,
I think we can move ahead, or we can also make the connection.
Yeah. Okay. Now my next question, my discussion point is that, okay, the multiple values, multiple stakeholders, multiple memories, and so on and so forth, because we are moving more and more towards the people-centered, or meaning getting the people, placing people at the heart of the discourse, and then values and central to all our discussions and so on. How do you identify or These are difficult questions, but how do you prioritize? Because so many conflicts, so many dissonance. How do you prioritize? Are these only for academic discussions, or is it for people like Pascal to engage in real management? And the related to this also, now who decides? Whose responsibility is it? In relation to World Heritage, we know that World Heritage values, so outstanding universal value, should transcend beyond national boundaries. So that does that mean that the decisions about which values or which memories to be interpreted should be guided by international community or the local community or collectively and so on? So the questions, it's a long question, but how do you prioritize which issues to be discussed, particularly in management or maybe even academic work, and who decides? Who wants to start? Maybe Peter, you
can I jump
yeah?
in? Well, wonderful question. So many ways to answer that.
Yes, I know.
But I wanted to start with Pascal's example of a conduct of a concert and a performance. And I think you know, the situation we have right now is very often that the concert kind of starts nicely and harmoniously, but somehow the orchestra breaks down very often, no? Or the concert doesn't come across as very convincing. And we're in a situation now where I think the criteria for actually determining what is a good cultural concert performance might be useful. And I think in this respect, to bring in also the jazzy tones that Dacia was saying, that allows for a bit of free jazz and a bit of dissonance there, to actually say a good concert performance, a good World Heritage performance, is also about working with and addressing dissonance. And that this is where we are. And that for me involves a shift in the ways that the system works, that sends a clear signal to states parties about how to engage with this dissonance as part of the terms of reference, so to speak, when you build a nomination, when you set up an interpretation plan, etc. It's also about engaging different violins and different music groups to go back to how the orchestra works. You know, it's difficult to work with dissonance, and it very often requires different skill sets, perhaps, than the ones that are usually mobilized to engage with heritage management. So this is also perhaps about inviting new instrument groups to the orchestra, social science skills to deal with the social complexity of dissonance and conflict, the kinds of different groups that Pascal was explaining exist in Robben Island, that may have an idea, that may have a stake, that may have certain rights associated with the area. So for me, it both entails about the criteria, but also about the people and the skill sets involved.
Thank you. Dacia, you want to add something? I think you have something to add.
Or maybe Pascal wants to come in, as Peter was speaking directly to your point.
Yeah, okay, Pascal.
My response would be very simple. I think we've gotten accustomed to the fact that heritage can be defined legally. There are instruments which define what is heritage and how it should be looked after. But I think society has also a responsibility to do so, because culture and the associated processes and outcomes are not static, and they keep on changing from time to time. And if we don't involve them from the beginning, and we don't take them on board at the local level, then we are likely to carry an inherent weak position that is characterized by what the state-based management system think should be protected. So here I'm talking about heritage, again, looking outside the limited and the restricted consultative processes that they have, which is for compliance purposes, it's for audit purpose, just to tick the box that we consulted the stakeholders, we did this. But we really need now to think about how to embrace stakeholder management approach in World Heritage Management. There's too much talk show. Because, for example, if you look at World Heritage processes, we like consulting stakeholders during reactive monitoring missions, but when it comes to the decision-making processes at the committee, they become observers. So we want to hear them when they're in their own context, but when we're making decisions about what they're interested in and what they're not interested in, we don't give them that voice for decision-making. So all I'm talking about here is that we have to involve all these people. Like at Robben Island, we took a step backwards and then invited everybody else on the table. And we developed, for example, one perspective that we developed was a strategic research agenda. We took stock of everything that has been published over the years, and we identified the gaps. And this is where we are now closing in with research to say which theme and which area, which was not probably profiled, we should focus on in the next 2-3 years. And we're doing that systematically. It's not an overnight process, but it's one way where you address it from research. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Dacia, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just, back what has been said already by Peter and Pascal. I think one of the things that I worry about myself sometimes, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it, is that, as we open up and say, diversity of opinions and bring everyone in and multivocality and all of this, which I espouse, but then of course, what we have seen in terms of the use of heritage by populist movements around the world and the abuse of heritage by these movements is that these, the heritage narratives can be used to uphold and communicate violent and exclusionary interpretations of sites as well. So, if we're being inclusive, do we have to include these narratives? I mean, of course, there's some limitations if they're breaking the law by denying historical events, but I just wonder how we can include these voices. And it's something I've been thinking about myself. And it just feels that, one way of doing it is, as Pascal has suggested, is a kind of taking a biographical approach to these sides where you take their whole biography, not just one bit of it. So like the Mosque of Cordoba, before it was the mosque and it had been a Visigothic temple, it has all these kind of aspects to it. I don't want to talk about layers because that makes it seem as if they're discrete moments in time where they're not, because again, each layer has legacies. And so I just wonder how we can use this. And to me, it feels like, aside from this kind of biographical approach that takes into consideration all the life of the place, everything that has gone into the making of this place, the different lines of legacies that each of those kind of histories has resulted in, is also creative. And I know I'm repeating myself a little bit, but focusing on heritage as a meaning-making process and therefore as a creative process that we can harness, that we can to some extent build on, and especially in terms of the direction in which we go in, right? So much about heritage now is being talked about as future making. So in heritage interpretation, we're not just making the past, but we're building the future. So what's the future that we want to have, and how can these heritage sites be platforms for beginning to discuss, have a conversation that moves us in that direction that we want to go in, rather than kind of backward looking and fighting about the past and who was the bigger victim in the past and all of that, which is my biggest fear, that competition over victimhood I find very limiting and dangerous. So I think opening them up instead for talking together about the future direction you want to go in might be a better way forward.
Thank you. I think you tried to answer some of my questions, address some of my questions. Yes, in fact, it's nice to start with sort of the idea of future making. And then, of course, the inclusivity and consultation with all relevant people, and also developing some sort of criteria, like Peter suggested, perhaps or to think new, think completely new, maybe. As Peter suggested, we need new knowledge areas, new training, new capacity building. So these are some of the things I believe the center will consider as well. And I think so. You can't just say these are the areas, these are the priorities, and who decides. You cannot specify, but broadly we need to think the inclusivity, collectivity, and the relevance of relevant stakeholders and so on. So thank you for that. And I just, if I may ask, before I go to last question as to how we go forward, do you have any answer to my question that who should be assessing these values in relation to World Heritage? Should they be, I think Pascal was firm that it is the local people, local authorities, but any other in 1 minute? Yes, Peter?
I fully agree. We'd like to have local authorities involved in these kind of things, but I also think it's an uneven playing field very often, and states parties need to take their big share of responsibility in taking this forward. That's one thing we've learned. Advisory bodies we've seen can do some of that, but only to a limited extent. No, so I think really to reaffirm the state party responsibility, but also the committee. I think the committee, the World Heritage Committee, needs to take its responsibility very seriously here. And of course, we've seen some risky developments in that respect. I would say, just in responding to Dasia's point about future thinking heritage indeed as a future oriented process, what's important, I think, for us to underline is that the committee has, or the World Heritage System has adopted quality criteria for thinking these as an equitable process, and so as part of its sustainable development policy commitments. So we don't, it's more about actually walking the talk on some of these things than sometimes necessarily needing to reinvent it. The problem is the more that the reinvention that's taking place right now, it tends to go the other direction, getting closer to the kind of populism and the risks of sort of capture of the heritage for other dynamics that Dacia was alluding to. So, but I think in a sense we have some of the ingredients, but they're not yet being turned into the kind of, you know, cooking and cake or that we're hoping for, no, that the aspirations initially aimed for. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I need that repeated again in the next question, next discussion. But for the audience listening to this discussion, please leave your questions in Q&A box. In 10 minutes, we'll be starting a Q&A session so that you can put your questions. So, okay, now my last question to the panelists. We also have 7 minutes to conclude this. There are sites with dissonance, and perhaps there will be future sites with dissonance. And do you have any future directions that we should be taking and we should be guiding the, particularly the center and the World Heritage process and in this direction? So is it, my main question is it only, can these be limited to interpretation or beyond? In my personal view, I think these have to be built into the entire management system. But what is your opinion? Give us some future directions and tell us what else can we do? Is it only academic exercises or is it going to the field? Thank you. Who want to start? Dacia, you want to start?
Sure.
I know you have suggested some of these things. Please repeat, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll pick up the gauntlet. Yeah. I mean, you know, you've already mentioned the problems with the current system, the overpowering power, if you like, of the nation state in terms of the UNESCO structure and the, you know, the attempt of the NGOs and the observer bodies to have a part, but that's limited. How do you include the local? I mean, I think, for me, I think the way forward, you know, the World Heritage convention, the way it's implemented, the operational guidelines, I think maybe that we can take some inspiration from the intangible side of things. You know, with intangible heritage, it's much easier for sites to be shared between different countries, right? One of the things that I've found hopeful and optimistic with intangible heritage is how many new sites are shared. So, you know, the tango is shared between Argentina and Uruguay. You have this sharing of gastronomic traditions. So, you know, I wonder if we recognize that even monumental heritage has important intangible dimensions, affective, relational, that's where the value sits. Can we begin to think about tangible sites the way we do about intangible is also shared? And I think in that sharing, where if I go back to that Savoir report, their call for a new relational ethics, I think we have this responsibility and ethical responsibility around engaging with the past, especially conflicted pasts, and with each other, with the affected communities. So, you know, celebrating a site in one way for one particular national history, heritage, or narrative can be a violence to other countries, nations, communities that experience that particular event in a very different way. And it feels like including those other voices doesn't diminish the site, doesn't diminish the narrative that might be celebratory. You know, there are sites that maybe celebrate industrial excellence and advances, but that industrial advance was done at the cost of lives, sometimes of that community, sometimes of other communities that were in indentured labor, slavery, forced labor, prisoner of labor work. And those stories are part of the success of the industrial site, right? So incorporating those other stories about it, don't diminish it in the same way as when Pascal was talking about Robben Island, including the story of the lepers, including the story of the women, the children of the men that were held there, including all those stories, doesn't diminish the political narrative, doesn't diminish the part of the heritage that is about Nelson Mandela. It just adds to the richness of the site. So I think it's about being a little bit less protective over these singular, very powerful singular narratives, and understanding that giving space to the other narratives doesn't diminish one's own. Actually, it makes the site more robust. You know, there's this contradiction in heritage where, you know, when it's singular, when it has one narrative, it feels very powerful and strong. But actually, it's quite vulnerable, because if that one narrative is in any way challenged, then it all crumbles. Whereas if there are all these narratives to a site, all this richness of the history, as in we were told with the Robben Island case, then if one of those narratives is challenged, well, it isn't an existential crisis for the site, right? Because there are all these other narratives. It's kind of like identity. If my entire identity were to be based entirely on my gender, and that becomes kind of challenged, then I crumble. But if it's based on 100 different things, then being challenged on one of them isn't an existential risk, isn't an existential attack. And I think that sense of, that's why I was trying to get at with the kind of dissonance potentially being something positive, in that it makes the heritage site more robust rather than fragile.
Thank you. Thank you. It's going. Peter?
Yes, thank you. Along the similar lines, I would say we need to think of dissonance not as a matter of shame, or right now as if we're revealing our dirty laundry when we talk about dissonance in World Heritage, but that it's actually something that's extremely constructive and good to talk about. So indeed, to see something valuable that brings something new to sites, a new form of resonance. And how do we do that? This was your question, Gamini, no? Should we just have a different form of interpretation, or do we need to go the full way? I think we need to go the full way, because we have opportunities throughout the World Heritage cycle, both in terms of, you know, when sites are being, of course, nominated, the preparation of that, but also in the evaluation process. And again, we need the committee to go in and basically ask state parties, did you do the job of actually looking at these issues of dissonance in your site? maybe even open up the committee, as there have been attempts to do, to have other voices by civil society and so on, to be able to speak when we know there are issues of dissonance. Again, incorporated in the mechanics, incorporated in the system that allows for dissonant resonance. That resonance is not ending up with these bland, glossy, singular, outstanding descriptions, but that it's actually about multiplicity of voices and all that are engaged in an equitable way. So I think we need to encourage the World Heritage System to walk the talk on implementing this in its mechanisms and its processes, but we also need the help of the advisory bodies and of course other states parties to play the role also of a good friends that can actually also raise difficult questions when states parties sometimes perhaps feel uncomfortable talking about it. This is part of it, no, I think, and that's where we need the systemic change to take place. So yeah, those would be my thoughts. Thank you, Gamini.
Pascal, any last comments?
Thank you very much. Just in addition to what my colleagues are saying, and I would like to reinforce this point that heritage and dissonance are continuous processes, because heritage is not static. And therefore, one of the things that could be considered, I think, is the whole issue of advancing good governance and multifocality in the entire process of World Heritage Management. And I think good governance or governance, it might be a foreign object or a foreign concept to most heritage institutions, but I think we need to move towards that, and we are talking about that in protected areas. Why can't we talk about that at cultural heritage sites? So that's my first point. And my second point is that linked to what Peter was saying, we are looking at we have to look at new capacity building measures that will bring those responsible for managing heritage closer to other disciplines, because it's one thing being trained as an archaeologist and being trained as a historian, but you are not a conflict resolutor. You don't have those skills, you don't have that capacity, and that's why these issues become hidden and are misrepresented. So we need to adapt other working models and capacity areas from other disciplines. And then my third point is that maybe in the bigger matrix of things, just like the way we have been dealing with sustainable development, we now have a policy on World Heritage and sustainable development. Why is it difficult for the state parties and the committee to really look at dissonance resonance guidelines to avoid both the local and the global processes suffocating some alternative interpretations and multifocality? If we leave it to the committee without some guidelines, the accountability level remains with the state party, and we know how state parties behave in these circumstances. And that's why you end up having communities writing to UNESCO, even fighting against an inscription, because it means that there's no framework and mechanism that is standard that can be applied to the state parties. And last but not least, of course, this one is a tired argument, but it has not been implemented. We need to look at these inclusive and holistic interpretation models where we actually give voice to other opposing opinions. And nowadays we have a competitive advantage that we're moving towards digitalization, which gives unlimited options for alternative presentations compared to physical exhibitions at the site, where you're forced maybe to look at one narrative. But with a digital or a virtual tour, you can almost say anything and present anything. So we just need to kick the box and work out with new thinking and new dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this was great. I think the starting with Dacia, that we need to look at things positively. Dissonance as a sort of positive things that bring positive results, and then adopting new governance systems and link into capacity building, particularly looking at other areas of conflict resolutions and preparing a dissonance document, guidelines like sustainable development, and also inclusive interpretation models. So this will help not only for interpretation, but also for the entire management system and entire management processes. So this is, I hope these are very valuable propositions as to address how to deal with dissonance issues at the current sites and also future sites. So I think all of you brought very, very interesting, very valuable thoughts, and I believe this session was very useful to the organizers, and hope we have kept to their expectations. For me, I'm not going to summarize because they are so rich. Every word for me is useful, and they can be rewritten and then look at, revisit it, and then those can be used as lessons and to go forward. So with that, thanking all three of you, Dacia, Peter, and Pascal, my friends and colleagues. I will now stop this session, and then we will go in for Q&A. Okay, I think we have some questions in Q&A, and also there are some questions coming from YouTube. We will start with Q&A. Can you look at them, or you want me to read? I will, I'm not sure. The first question from Q&A from Mohammed Mcdad: how dissonance could be addressed in the environment of state monopoly of the World Heritage Sites in their jurisdiction as the main stakeholder rather than local community? How the role of the national state could be more constructive in this process. I think this is something we discussed, but I like comments from all three of us, even very briefly. We answered this, but this was something I posed also because there is this national sovereignty guaranteed by the convention, but at the same time, it's the state-driven process, and all the nodal agencies are state, and also, although there are opportunities for consultative process and some advisory bodies looking at whether consultation has taken place and so on. So yeah, Peter, you want to start?
Just very briefly that indeed, as you say, Gamini, it is a state-driven process, and that's not going to change. But I think that has been a clear policy shift that opens up this not to be a state monopoly only. And there are clear quality criteria now. We're perhaps not so clear yet. That's maybe the problem for including other voices. There are calls for human rights-based approaches that have been adopted. There are calls for free, prior, and informed consent as well to be implemented. So these are some of the mechanisms that are in the making. I don't think they're quite sufficient yet, neither in the way they've been articulated or how they're being implemented, but it's clearly a basis that opens up for that discussion. Another thing that we've discussed a lot with you, Gamini, over the years has been the need to, of course, not only focus on management as a matter of managing OUV, the outstanding universal value, but as Gamini and you and I have talked so many times, it's also about how management of the full set of values is being addressed. And I think that's something where it's increasingly coming up, but as part of those full set of values, also conflicted values and so on need to be addressed. And I think here more emphasis can be made to actually incorporate that in the system.
Thank you. Pascal, you are happy to answer this question. You are a state party representative yourself, and is there a way out or more proactive way to
I think it's a very tricky question in the sense that legally and in terms of the convention, the state party is the main player.
Yeah.
And that's why earlier on I spoke about maybe the center or the committee looking at its reviewing its governance structures, we should also give other local stakeholders an equal opportunity to give input into the decision-making process, because they are represented by the same people that are oppressing them at home. And I don't see how it will work in committee sessions. So the issue around governance, but also we must be mindful that the monopoly of the state might not change, and we have to find ways of working around it. I'll give you an example. With liberation heritage in Africa, it's always the ruling party that is in control, and they even determine which kind of heritage should be celebrated. So as long as you are not in power, you are not going to have that freedom to celebrate your own heritage. But the question is, how do you then create other mechanisms around this state monopoly to make sure that you are equally recognized? So for example, in SADC, the frontline liberation movements, your ZANU-PF, ANC, they're in power and they're determining what is happening to liberation heritage. But it doesn't mean that we have to avoid talking about the other political parties and their liberation heritage. So all I'm saying is that, yes, there's monopoly. We can overcome it through maybe adjusting governance issues, but at the same time, it's a problem that will remain with us for a long time. We have to think of mechanisms like what Peter was saying, of going around this monopoly and getting to resolve these issues. Thank you.
Yeah. Dacia, you have any views on that?
Yeah, perhaps just to say, I mean, I agree with everything that has been said. I think the state parties need to be, as Peter was saying, encouraged to think a bit differently than they have. I think good practice guidelines, as both of my colleagues have suggested, are absolutely necessary, but not just, good practice guidelines, but also systems of reporting and monitoring, because as we've all insisted, this is an ongoing process. So you can't just, okay, let's agree on this interpretation and that's done and dusted, right? You have to keep going on, because as governments changes, different narratives will come to the fore and others will be silenced. So I think it has to be a continuous and ongoing process. I don't know if, the World Heritage Program was designed, it wasn't created for the purpose of engaging in thoughtful and ethical ways of dealing with difficult pasts and war and violence. That's not why it was created. It was a vehicle for celebrating the achievements of humanity. Yeah. So if the whole character of the World Heritage System is changing, then the framework that upholds it and the mechanisms also have to change. Otherwise, why not use the Memory of the World program instead? And why make these sites World Heritage sites if that's not what the point of the list was? So I think we need to change everything that sits under it if we're going to change the kinds of sites that are being listed and the reasons for it. And again, it comes back to me to really convincing nation states that having a diverse interpretation and being able to incorporate into their historical narratives bits of their history that maybe they're not so proud of isn't a sign of weakness, but actually a sign of robustness and strength, that you're able to say, yes, we got this wrong. Yes, we did lousy things, and it's part of who we are in our history, and we have to deal with those legacies now. It's a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. There's this fabulous, whenever you have a quiet moment in your various lockdowns, COVID lockdowns around the world, there's a TED talk by the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She's the author of the Half of the Yellow Sun, that wonderful novel about the Biafra War in Nigeria. But there's this TED talk that she gives on the danger of singular narratives, which is fantastic. And I highly recommend you to listen to. She's also a wonderful speaker, but she talks about those dangers of seeing each other in singular ways as representing singular things, when again, we're all so complex, and that complexity again is strength and is robustness. So I think convincing nation states to do that. And I don't know if, so that's my kind of big ambition kind of thing, but I don't know if one of the mechanisms also for getting there is that when nation states kind of put forward nominations, if that can also go through national parliaments. I mean, I know not all parliaments are as representative as we would like them to be, but if there can be because it often goes, I think, for a very diplomatic kind of from the Ministry of Culture, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it kind of sits there, but could these consultations sit at the parliamentary level where there's a parliamentary discussion around which sites, which heritage sites might be proposed and put forward, and more of a consultation at the local level as well before it goes up to the kind of Ministry of Culture level. I'm not sure if that might be one way of making this kind of multivocal process of deciding which sites to designate as to propose as heritage, World Heritage.
Yeah. I think, I mean, all of you said this because things are changing, things are evolving as the entire World Heritage process is evolving. So hope, let's keep hope on that, like Peter said. So many things have included, so many changes have happened. People's voices, multiple voices are going to be heard. So hopefully we will have a better future for that. The next question is relatively long. Can I read it or can you look at it? Or you want me to read? Okay, thanks indeed for your interesting and insightful questions and discussion. I would like to ask one question relating to the World Heritage Sites and UNESCO. Due to the increasing significance in the multiple values and voices, the stories of the marginalized groups are newly highlighted in the existing World Heritage Sites. However, some groups are concerned that multiple stories would harm the narratives of outstanding universal value in the existing World Heritage Sites. In addition, dissonance of World Heritage Sites has been developed into the political disputes. UNESCO seems to be a dilemma between nationalism and internationalism. If so, should UNESCO be the only institution to make a harmony, or is there any alternative options on creating dialogue between different stakeholders in the World Heritage Sites? This is a question from Yoon Kung Lee. Well, again, something that has already been discussed, but coming up again and again, and very interesting question. Anyone wants to give a start? We don't have much time also. We have 7 more minutes to go this question, and we have 2 more questions.
I'm happy to jump in,
Yeah,
Gamini.
please,
I think very, very rapidly, I think that the UNESCO and the World Heritage Committee offer an international framework, but fundamentally, dialogues between different stakeholders will need to be driven nationally, of course, but also in the case that, of course, these concern interstate relations, so intergovernmental relationships, then indeed, I think that one needs to explore also the perhaps thinking about new mechanisms for the World Heritage Program to facilitate dialogue. No, when we have signals from problem analysis and so on that there are risks of geopolitical tensions and so on, then clearly there is, I think, a responsibility here also from UNESCO as the host of the World Heritage Convention to play that facilitative role. And that I think is something that perhaps can be strengthened. And it's been done on an ad hoc basis right now. It's probably worth an exploration to see what opportunities there are to actually do that more systematically. And part of that, indeed, as Dacia is saying, perhaps also we can learn from processes of international cooperation, both from the Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage, but also other arenas that involve engaging multiple, states in one process.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. I hope Ms. Kun Lee is happy with that. I have one more short question from Jonathan Bildo. I'll read it. I have been concerned about how commercialization, World Heritage heightens dissonance, which does not promote peaceful interaction. Should commercialization be discouraged? Who wants to answer that?
I think, Gamin, this one, commercialization is a necessary evil. A necessary evil in the sense that World Heritage sites, they never get adequate funding from national governments. They have to raise money to invest into the conservation, maintenance, and interpretation of the sites. But on the other side, you have commercialization, which is done out of context and is not sympathetic to what the site stands for. And that's very dangerous. But more importantly, I think what is lacking is this whole beneficiation mechanism at World Heritage sites. How do we distribute the benefits of this commercialization to benefit the stakeholders? So heritage institutions, they don't have good experience in those areas because they always think about raising revenue for their own administration and survival. So sustainability is not an issue that relates to the management authorities only, but also the communities that are involved with the World Heritage Site. So I think there's more that we can do to look at how we localize sustainable development goals and how we create measurable benefits that are going to accrue to the communities. Because I always get shocked when I look at management plans for World Heritage Sites. It's very rare to see an objective that is looking at this element to say, what is it that we're going to do for communities in terms of contributing to their livelihoods? Because it's not our space. We want to be the compliance officers. We want to be the only beneficiaries, and that's what is getting us into trouble. So I think those are the issues that we need to address, but otherwise it's a necessary evil.
Okay, thank you. One more question from YouTube.
Could I just jump in?
Peter, you want to say?
Also?
Yeah, please do.
Yes,
do,
in a sense, I think it's an interesting question from, I agree with both the question from Jonathan and also Pascal's perspective here. And a little bit, I would say it's a question about the quality also of how commercialization takes place, obviously, indeed. So raising issues like benefit sharing, not only necessarily an evil as such, but it depends, of course, on how it's done. I mean, I do think that it's a genuine motivational factor for many to get engaged. But as we've seen, for example, in work we've done on public-private partnerships, it's a very uneven playing field, and as very often the kinds of livelihood issues that Pascal is clearly underlining tend to get a bit of a backseat compared to other more powerful actors kind of capturing these commercial opportunities. So I think it's not discouragement, but rather let's look at encouraging practices that are equitable and that, as Pascal says, address issues like inequalities and benefit sharing explicitly. Thank you.
Thank you. I have two more questions. I don't know whether we have time. One question is very long, but I'm going to read it for the sake of our information. Namung King. Despite the fact that heritage is inherently dissonant, national policies tend to keep history of people and space linear for stability of social identity and structure, in my view. Luckily, in democratic society, the general public has the potential to change the limited narrative of heritage if the people become interculturally competent in dealing with manifold meanings and voices coming from it. But what about the other regime that doesn't allow the dissonance to be recognizable to its people, let alone expression of it? There must be a different approach that enables people to be involved in dealing with the dissonance of their heritage and keeping the process bending and non-violent. Looking forward to your insights on this issue. Well, it's a long one. I also have another question from Ini O. Could I ask some past examples to show that conflict has been reduced and discussion is possible in spite of the dissonance existed by accepting different viewpoints each other on a certain heritage and creating harmonizing and inclusive interpretation on it? So these questions are very interesting. Our time has passed, but if anyone of you are interested, yes, please go ahead on commenting on both of those questions. Who wants to start? Yes, Peter, please go ahead.
Yeah, let's see. I think you know, again, if I understand the first question correctly, it's indeed about how do we actually deal with these in uneven playing fields, sometimes violent situations, and how do we transform that? What kind of mechanisms are in place? And there, I think we've seen a number of countries that through their national legislative systems have adopted, participatory dialogue tools and mechanisms and so on that actually have forwarded a lot of discussion. So we've seen that in the case of Canada, for example, in their engagement with Indigenous peoples. We've seen nominations that have really taken Indigenous peoples also jointly in the driving seat in that respect. And therefore, to respond to the second question, offer examples about how, despite a colonial past and colonial present in many ways in terms of the state apparatus and so on, the World Heritage at least can try to offer new ways of doing things. And that's not done overnight, of course, but it can be done. I think the point we can learn from these cases is that we need to not just leave this up to national mechanisms and dynamics, but we need to highlight this even more. Again, as I said earlier today, this has already been adopted as policy by the World Heritage Committee. So it's basically just about rolling it out, walking the talk, and making this a priority also for assessing the monitoring and evaluation. So such mechanisms need to be highlighted, as Dacia and others have been saying, as good practice, as something that really should be rewarded in the World Heritage system and not just dependent upon national legislation.
Thank you. Any one of you, Pascal or Dacia, you want to have your reflections? Yes, Pascal.
Just briefly, in addition to what Peter is saying, dissonance cannot be separated from politics and political systems in a particular country. And I'll give you an example of Barotse cultural landscape in Zambia, which is being considered for possible inscription. And now there's an objection from a particular community in the Barotse cultural landscape. And when you read the objection and do a little bit of background checking, you realize that there's a mixture of politics, a mixture of socioeconomic issues, and some of it is just awareness on their plight. So what I'm trying to say is that UNESCO is not going to come and sort out these local issues, because UNESCO has to remain as neutral as possible. So the burden remains with the state party. And I think we have to think differently. Instead of running away from these issues, we have to confront them head on. We have to become politicians and begin to separate political issues, world heritage issues, and find what I call interconnecting positions, because you're not going to be able to solve everything. But what is it that connects the people and the processes that we're doing? And what is it that connects the people together as a people of a particular space? And how do we utilize that to our strength to move forward with some of these processes? Thank you.
That's your last words.
Yeah, maybe just to add to, I mean, I agree with what Peter and Pascal have said, and just to add to that, and to build on Pascal's suggestion of the emphasis on interconnectivity, which I agree is fundamental. I just, unfortunately, the process of declaring a site World Heritage has often had the impact of actually creating a distance between the local community and the site, disowning the local community in favor of this universal value of creating barriers between the local communities and these sites. And I think that has to stop. It has created all kinds of not only dissonance, but violent situations where people are displaced away from their ancestral homelands in the name of preserving a site as World Heritage. And I really think the way to this shift in thinking that we're all calling for, which has to think about heritage sites and World Heritage sites as sites of interpretation and dialogue, not as museum pieces over which you put a glass case to protect them, but they really as open spaces where these communities that live around the places for whom these sites have kind of, if you like, almost mundane relation to these sites. They're part of their everyday lives. For us, they might be exceptional. For me, Petra is exceptional. For me, Angkor Wat is exceptional. Robben Island is exceptional for me. But for people who live with these sites, they're part of their everyday lives. And that has to be valued as well, which is also building on something Peter said earlier. They can't be alienated in the name of the exceptional value. They have to be, the mundane everyday relations of these sites have to be included. And I think that goes through making these sites of creative, ongoing, constant dialogue and interpretation, and not kind of crystallizing them and throwing them into a glass case. So in that kind of response also to Hyun Lee's earlier question in the Q&A as well.
Thank you. I think these are good words to conclude these sessions, but if you have any one or two sentences to conclude, any one of you, or our time has passed, but any impression of the session, overall session, and if you want to say one line or just take half a minute and say something. Yeah.
From my side, I would just say thank you so much. It's been an extremely constructive session. I think we're showing the value of having discussions around dissonance, and we've been very agreeing with each other a lot. But I think that trying to open that space still, we need to recognize is not there yet. No. So I think if the partners of this webinar, both are from the African World Heritage Program, the center, and also the Korean Center, indeed can pave the way towards shaping and continuing this dialogue. That would be extremely welcome, I think. So thank you indeed for organizing this.
Thank you, Pascal. You have.
Thank you very much, Gamin, and the organizers. I think it was a very interesting discussion. And as a parting shot, I'd like to make reference to my continent, where new heritage typologies are emerging, and they are relating to social memory, sites of conflict. And I think instead of seeing difficulties, we must see challenges in addressing these issues. And we must convert these challenges into opportunities of moving world heritage beyond the confines of the criteria and the restrictive thinking on what heritage is all about, and who should decide what is heritage and how should that be presented. So to me, dissonance is an opportunity that can take us to a new thinking and a new mindset shift in terms of implementing the World Heritage. Thank you.
Yeah, Tasha, last word is yours.
No, I think Pascal's parting shot was a perfect note to end on.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to all wonderful colleagues who were discussants. And I mean, it is for me, it went beyond my imagination. I thought there will be many questions, many conflicts among themselves, and I think looking at dissonance as a sort of positive thing and to the willingness to work more and the opportunities to raise more is a wonderful thing that came up, and I believe this will be taken up by the center, and I think we have done justice to the objectives of the center, who wanted to open up this discussion. In my view, it was indeed a great discussion. So hopefully we will pick up these points in the future, and the center will pick up some of these, not some, all of these points, and then work towards better protection of heritage with conflicts, and of course, all heritage sites. Thank you very much for three of you again, once again, and then Harry and the center for inviting me and our team, and also for organizing this wonderful session. Thank you very much. Over to you, Harry.
Thank you so much, Kamini, for your wonderful moderating the discussion, and Dathia, Pascal, and Peter for your deep and interesting discussion. And above all, the audiences who watched and participated in the discussion for making this webinar all the more interesting and interactive. Today's passionate discussion will lead to the next webinar, where we will discuss diverse aspects of the dissonance through 3 specific cases that are Hagia Sophia in Turkey, the sites of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution, and Gorée Island in Senegal. It will be a very intense discussion, so please don't miss it. And we still have 4 more webinars to come in the first half of this year, so please join our journey. I have one last advertisement of our webinar. We are also launching a video contest webinar on the theme of reconciliation and peace through World Heritage. We look for the cases of how reconciliation and peace have become part of protecting and managing World Heritage and other heritage sites. Make a 5-minute video, and with a short production note and written plot, just submit them to us. We will share the information on our Facebook tomorrow, so please keep an eye on us. So thanks again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at the next webinar in April. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, thank you very much.